They say that when gold wants to know if it's loved for its shine or for its weight, it hides in the dust. That's more or less what Kwame did. A man of wealth, heir to a fortune known by most in the city only by hearsay, he was tired of parties full of fake smiles, of handshakes that trembled inside, of women who looked more at the car than into his eyes. One day Kwame decided he needed to breathe different air. He put on old clothes, smeared his hands with grease, and with a small wooden cart, began wandering the streets as if he were a simple garbage collector. It was in a forgotten part of the city, where the asphalt cracked and windows closed early, that Amina lived. A widow with a soft voice and deep gaze, she was known in the neighborhood as the seamstress. Not just any seamstress, her stitches were strong, her fabrics held stories. But what drew the most attention wasn't her needlework, it was the silence she carried. A silence born from an old wound. The man she had loved in her youth had turned his back on her, leaving her with only a frail daughter, whose health was always hanging by a thread. In the alleys and markets, people talked. Some pitied her, poor Amina with a sick daughter and no man to help her. Others, with malicious whispers, said, "Well, sewing to survive. She'll never get out of that life." Amina heard it all. She didn't respond. She held her head high, even when her pockets were empty and the nights were cold. It was on one such overcast morning that Kwame and Amina's paths crossed. He was pushing his cart, collecting paper and bottles, when he saw her door ajar. In the yard, clothes on the line swayed lazily. From inside, the weak sound of a child's cough pierced the air. For a moment, he stopped, as if the walls of that house spoke to him. But their first meeting wasn't gentle. When she saw him approach, with worn clothes and a face covered in dust, Amina, accustomed to unwanted glances and approaches, hardened her expression. "I have nothing to give here," she said firmly, her voice harsher than she intended. Kwame said nothing. He simply lowered his head and, as he walked away, picked up a small wooden toy that belonged to Amina's daughter. He carefully cleaned it and left it on the doorstep. Then, he went on his way. It was a small gesture, but in that instant, deep inside Amina's heart, something stirred. Not hope she no longer dared to hope, but it was like a light breeze that makes the curtains flutter, even in a house closed for a long time. In that neighborhood of narrow alleys and houses pressed against each other, a new face didn't go unnoticed. Even more so, a man like Kwame, unknown and suddenly roaming the area frequently. He wore worn-out pants, a faded shirt, and a cap that partially hid his face. He pushed his old wooden cart, battered by the elements, filled with papers, cans, and bits of iron he collected from the streets. To a casual observer, he was just another man trying to survive. But to the keen eyes of the women sweeping the sidewalks and the old men playing checkers under the trees, this collector was different. The way he walked wasn't that of a man bowed by life's weight. There was dignity in his step, and when he stopped in front of houses, his eyes weren't those of someone begging or seeking pity. They were watchful eyes, seeing more than just dust on the sidewalks or iron in the yards. The first to notice was Dona Zulima, Amina's neighbor, a sharp-tongued woman who spent afternoons leaning on a crochet pillow at her window, observing everything. It was she who one late afternoon uttered the phrase that would soon spread through the neighborhood. "Have you seen that filthy man, always lurking around Amina's house?" And it's not recent. The comments spread quickly. At the bakery, the butcher's, the market lines, whispers went around. That collector, strange, always watching her house. But no one knew what was going on inside Kwame's heart. Every morning, as he donned those tattered clothes and hid his true identity, it wasn't money that drove him. It was the desire to touch a world that had long seemed distant, to see people who didn't kneel before his wealth. And since the day he met Amina's gaze, that gaze marked by sadness, yet still proud, something inside him had changed. It wasn't pity he felt. It was deep respect for the silent strength of that woman, for how she faced adversity without ever asking for anything, and above all, for the tenderness in her gestures with her sick daughter. On hot afternoons, when the sun dipped and neighbors brought in their chairs, Kwame would always pass by Amina's house. He wouldn't knock, wouldn't speak. He would just leave small tokens of care, a repaired toy on the gate, a new dishcloth, folded discreetly, a bag of fresh bread, without a note, left as if by fate. Amina's daughter, little Halima, was the first to notice. Her big, alert eyes watched this different man, and when he appeared, a faint smile would cross her pale face. It wasn't just any smile. It was the smile of someone who, even in illness, still sensed that the world could be kind. Seeing that smile, Kwame felt the weight of his deception grow, because it was no longer just a game. More and more, his steps led him not just through the streets of the neighborhood, but to the heart of that house. The afternoons turned into a ritual. He would pass by, pretend to pick up a piece of paper, steal a glance inside, and move on. Amina, for her part, pretended not to see, but inside, a storm churned. Who was this man? Why was he always around her house? What was he after? Outwardly, she remained firm. Inwardly, old wounds stirred. She could no longer afford weaknesses. Life had taught her through tears and sleepless nights that the world was cruel to women like her, and that any poorly tied bond could turn into a chain. But deep down, something began to change. Not hope, a doubt, a small thread of light weaving through the cracks of her soul. Perhaps not every stranger brings danger. Perhaps there is still goodness in a man's steps, but she didn't dare believe it. Not yet. Meanwhile, the neighborhood gossip sharpened. People said, even the little girl smiles at him. What is Amina hiding? And the name of this mysterious collector, which no one really knew, now circulated in suspicious whispers. But Kwame didn't care. What did words matter when what he sought was something much greater? He, who owned lands, cars, fat bank accounts, now wanted just one thing, a gaze that would see not his gold, but his heart. And in that small neighborhood, in that modest house with a loom in the corner of the room and patched walls, a story began to grow, one that no amount of money could buy. Nights fell early in that part of the city, even when a bit of light still lingered in the sky. It was as if the weight of the days pushed the hours forward, wanting everything to quiet down faster. And so it was in Amina's house. By 7 in the evening, the windows were shut, the curtains drawn, and the flickering light of a lamp trembled in one corner of the room. Inside, time moved differently. Not the time of the streets, nor the time of the neighbors chatting at their gates. It was the time of those who lived to care for others, expecting little from tomorrow. Amina spent her nights sewing, not for pleasure, but out of necessity. The small mending jobs from the neighbors barely paid for her daughter's medicine, and whatever remained went toward beans, rice, flour. Her once soft hands were now hardened by needles and coarse fabric. But she never complained. No words of complaint were ever heard from her lips. The sadness she carried needed no words. It was in her eyes, in how she pinned her hair, in how she folded fabrics, in the heavy silence that filled the house. During this time, Kwame continued his rounds, always along the same path, always at the same time. He was no longer just a collector. He was part of the scenery. But what he didn't know was that Amina's heart was at war, an old war, against a past that never left her in peace. Years earlier, when her eyes still sparkled with hope, Amina had met a man. Idris was his name. Young, handsome, son of wealthy merchants. They fell in love, or so she believed. At first it was a secret romance, smiles exchanged at the market, notes hidden in folds of fabric. Later, a clandestine relationship. When she discovered she was pregnant, she believed love would overcome the difference in social classes, but she was wrong. Pressured by his family, Idris disappeared. He vanished like a wind that suddenly stops. And with him went all Amina's dreams and promises. Pregnant and unsupported, she faced shame and loneliness. Expelled from her uncle's house, she wandered until she found shelter in that forgotten part of the city. There, with the help of an old seamstress, she learned the trade and raised her daughter alone. Each stitched seam was also a patch on her own soul. Each garment delivered was a lesson in humility and resilience. But fate, with its whims, loves to test the strong. On a stifling morning, as she delivered mending work to a client, Amina saw a figure she thought was long buried in the past. Idris, fatter, older, but with the same air of superiority. Now a businessman, owner of a shop downtown, well-dressed, shiny watch on his wrist. He saw her too, and what Amina feared came true. That very day, Idris appeared at her door, with a cynical smile and sweet words laced with poison. He said he had heard about her daughter and was willing to help, that she no longer needed to live that way. But then came the condition, masked as false generosity. In return, he wanted Amina to be his woman, in secret, away from society's judgment. The proposal cut deep. Inside, Amina trembled. The bills were piling up, her daughter's health worsening by the day. The medicine supply was low, and the doctor had already warned her. Without treatment, the child would deteriorate quickly. It was temptation in disguise, a test of fate, to yield or resist, to trade her honor for temporary relief, or to remain true to the dignity she still had. That night, she didn't sleep. Sitting by her daughter's bed, watching the girl's thin face, she cried silently. She couldn't give in. The next morning, with a steady voice and a direct gaze, she gave her answer. No, Idris, not for my daughter, not for anyone. I would rather face hunger than shame. Idris laughed scornfully but left with wounded pride. And from that day on, tension grew. Rumors began to circulate. Malicious whispers, veiled questions. Kwame, watchful, saw and heard it all. Each encounter with Amina deepened his desire to protect her, but his lie weighed heavily. How could he defend her when he himself was not who he claimed to be? Yet, something stronger than fear stirred inside him, admiration. The way Amina rejected Idris's offer, despite everything, revealed a woman of rare strength. No longer just a seamstress, but a woman whose gaze held honor. In the weeks that followed, Kwame realized that his disguise no longer concealed what was growing in his heart. It was no longer mere curiosity or respect. It was a deep feeling, a desire to be close, to support, to be a bridge knot, a wall in that woman's life. But at the same time, he felt trapped in his own deception. The longer it went on, the harder it would be to reveal the truth. And the more he got to know Amina, the more he feared disappointing her. Her past was a burden, his was a secret. And amid these weights, an unexpected story began to unfold. It was market day in the village. One of those mornings when the sun didn't hide and the heat seemed to rise from the ground. The streets buzzed with voices, laughter, vendors shouting about their goods in chorus, like an improvised theater. Sacks of flour, baskets of vegetables, colorful fabrics hanging on stalls. A familiar scene, almost always the same, where people tried to forget their troubles for a few hours. As usual, Amina had woken early. She prepared her daughter, who that day seemed a little better, and left with a straw basket on her arm. She didn't have much to buy, but needed a few vegetables and, above all, to show the neighborhood she was still standing. In places like that, the appearance of strength was as necessary as bread. But that day, the market winds carried more than the smells of spices and ripe fruit. Rumors swirled in the air, stories whispered on corners, glances exchanged between women, stifled giggles. Idris, still stung by Amina's rejection, had not kept quiet. He spread venomous words, insinuating that the poor seamstress was receiving visits from a mysterious man, a garbage collector. They said Dan that it was no coincidence she could now afford expensive medicine for her daughter. Once spread, the venom of gossip takes on a life of its own. It needs no proof, only tongues willing to repeat it. And that day, the market buzzed, not just from the heat, but from the rumors. Amina, proud as ever, ignored it. She walked past the stalls with a firm gaze, chin held high, as if she heard nothing, as if she knew nothing. But inside, her heart pounded harder. Every whisper, every sidelong glance, every smirk hurt more than the needles that had so often pierced her fingers. It was at the old suffuse stall that the inevitable happened. Idris, surrounded by acquaintances, seized the moment. He raised his voice, knowing everyone would hear. "Look here, the Honorable Amina. What courage! Refuses my help, but accepts the company of a garbage collector. Now that's honor." The heavy silence that followed was deafening. The whispers ceased. All eyes turned to her. For a moment, the ground seemed to give way beneath her. But Amina didn't lower her head. She held her basket tightly and, with calm steps, crossed the small circle that had formed around her. She said nothing, didn't defend herself, didn't cry. She simply walked. Her dignity, at that moment, was her only defense. Kwame, watching from a distance, witnessed the scene. Every word from Idris struck him like stones. For a moment, he wanted to step in, reveal everything, put Idris in his place, but he held back. His lie still chained him. He had no right to expose himself, not yet. That night, Amina's house was quieter than usual. After putting her daughter to sleep, she sat at the table, her head in her hands. The day's weight felt heavier than her body. Tears came, not in torrents, but like a fine rain, soaking deeply. Each tear was an unspoken scream, a knot trapped in her throat. Outside, the neighborhood slept, but Kwame across the street remained hidden in the shadows. He watched the dim lamplight through the window. The respect he already felt for this woman deepened into profound admiration. There was more strength in her silence than in 1,000 speeches. Hours later, when the streets were deserted, Kwame approached the house. Through the window pane, he saw Amina sewing alone under the faint light. The needle rose and fell on the fabric, as if trying to mend a wounded soul. He realized then that in this house lived a strength that not even the sharpest tongue could break. The next day, the market buzzed again, but something had changed. Some neighbors, perhaps ashamed of the previous day's scene, now looked at Amina with a hint of respect. Others, still driven by envy, kept their venom ready, but she kept going. With steady steps and a serene gaze, Kwame meanwhile knew he could no longer just watch. Something inside him called for action, not out of vanity, not to win her heart, but because, in that corner of the city, he had found a woman worth more than all the riches he owned, and protecting her had now become a calling he could no longer ignore. The nights began to grow cooler in that corner of the city. The wind blew harder through the cracks in the windows, carrying the scent of wet earth and dry leaves. It was the time of year when people stayed indoors earlier, and neighbors gathered less on the sidewalks. In Amina's house, the routine remained the same, a silence heavier than the air. A routine marked by mending, needles, and constant worry over her daughter. Kwame still passed by, always at the same time, with the same cart creaking over the uneven cobblestones. He no longer needed to pretend to collect what others threw away. The neighborhood already considered him part of the scenery, though still with wary or disdainful glances. But what few noticed was that, with each passing day, his steps slowed in front of Amina's house. His gaze heavier with feelings he struggled to hide. One afternoon, noticing the door ajar and Amina absorbed in her loom, unaware of his approach, Kwame stopped. Not by intention, but by a greater force. He stood there, for long moments, caught between the desire to approach and the fear of invading that space of sorrow and dignity. It was Halima, with her weak voice, who broke the silence. "Mami, the man with the cart is outside." Amina lifted her eyes, and for the first time, looked at Kwame without the barrier of distrust, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps the weight of the recent days, or maybe the constant presence of this man, who had never asked for anything nor brought offense, was beginning to awaken something gentler within her. Without many words, in an almost instinctive gesture, she motioned for him to come closer. Kwame, heart pounding, crossed the small yard. It wasn't fear of confrontation. He had faced powerful men in the business world. It was the fear of disrespecting a woman who, even amidst poverty and loneliness, held rare pride. They sat on the porch. There was no formality, no need for introductions. In that moment, they were simply two souls marked by life, each with their own scars. The conversation began timidly, a few phrases about the weather, about her daughter, about hard days. But little by little, the invisible barrier that had always surrounded Amina began to give way, perhaps from the fatigue of carrying it all alone, perhaps from Kwame's gaze, one that neither judged nor pressured. It was then, with a soft voice and a gaze lost on the horizon, that she began to speak. "There was a time when I believed in love, in those foolish young girl dreams, when the heart believes in promises. But I learned, the hard way, that words are lost to the wind. In the end, we are alone, with what we can carry here inside," she said, placing her hand over her heart. She spoke of her past, of the man she had loved, of the promises she had heard, of the abandonment, not in details that would expose too much, but with the raw truth of someone who had lived and survived. She spoke of the day when, alone, with her daughter in her arms and nothing to her name, she had made a silent vow: "I will never again depend on any man, not on pity, not on charity. If I must survive, it will be with my own hands, and if I must fall, I will fall with my dignity intact." Kwame listened silently. Each of her words felt like a stone in his chest, not because the story shocked him, he knew well the injustices of the world, but because, with each sentence, he understood the greatness of the woman before him. She was not just a seamstress, she was a warrior, still standing out of love for her daughter and out of respect for herself. And the more she spoke, the heavier Kwame's deception became. The disguise, once a way to protect himself from ulterior motives, was now a chain preventing him from being true with this woman. With each glance she gave him, unaware of his true identity, remorse grew. How could she trust him if she ever learned the truth? How could she respect him if she discovered that the humble man who listened was, in reality, a wealthy man hidden in rags? But in that moment, there was no space for revelations, only for listening. And Kwame, weighed down with thoughts, stayed, not out of pity, but out of deep respect, one that had grown, day by day, into a feeling he could no longer deny. When night fell, Amina withdrew inside with a simple nod. Kwame remained on the empty porch for a moment longer. He looked up at the starless sky, and there, he made a silent vow that somehow he would help this woman, not out of duty, but for something greater, already blooming in his heart. And without knowing it, they had taken a step, a small one, almost imperceptible, but one that would forever change the course of their lives. Time passed, indifferent to human pain. In the neighborhood, the days seemed to repeat themselves. Women washed clothes at the communal taps, men played cards under the trees, children ran through the alleys. But in Amina's house, each new dawn was a silent battle. Halima, her daughter, was visibly worsening. The fever rose at night, and the medicine was no longer enough. Each pill Amina gave her daughter was counted, split, stretched as far as possible. But there were limits that even a mother's love couldn't overcome. The doctor's bill was unpaid. The pharmacist hesitated to sell on credit. The little money from sewing barely covered the essentials. Each day, the despair in Amina's chest grew stronger, but never, not for a second, did she consider going back on her refusal to Idris. She would rather let hunger knock at her door than sell her honor or her word. Kwame could tell. He didn't need to ask. Amina's face looked more tired, her gaze heavier, her shoulders more stooped. Halima, once smiling in her rare moments of strength, now spent her days lying on the mat, her breathing weak, her face pale. One afternoon, after much thought, Kwame decided to act, not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, but as someone who could no longer stand by. He discreetly purchased the necessary medicine. He asked his driver, a trusted man, keeper of many secrets, to deliver the package to Amina's door at nightfall, anonymously. Night came, heavy with dark clouds. Amina, as usual, was sewing by the lamplight. A faint noise at the door caught her attention. When she opened it, she found a brown paper-wrapped package. When she opened it, her eyes filled with tears. The medicine, new, complete, expansive, something she could not have bought. Her heart raced. Who could have done this? Who would know how serious things were? For a moment, she thought of Idris, but no, he would never do such a thing without asking something in return. She looked around. The street was deserted. Only darkness and a distant dog barking. With trembling hands, she gave the medicine to her daughter. That night, for the first time in a long while, Halima took a full dose. The fever subsided slightly, and her sleep became calmer. But though Amina felt gratitude, she also felt unease. The neighbors quickly noticed the next day, when they saw Halima looking a bit better, and heard about the new medicine. The gossip began. Someone is helping that woman. But who? They say the collector is always around. Coincidence? The rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers in doorways, in market lines, in sewing circles. Amina's honor, already tested by Idris, became the talk of the town again. She felt the weight of it. Each time she stepped outside, each glance felt like an unspoken accusation. But for her daughter's sake, she chose silence. She would use the medicine. If there was an anonymous angel, so be it. Her daughter's health mattered more than her reputation. Kwame, meanwhile, heard the rumors and felt torn. He hadn't meant to cause her more suffering, but he couldn't do nothing. Deep down he knew, though his gesture was noble, it only added to the web of lies and silences surrounding them. The following nights were hard for both. Amina struggled with shame and fear of new gossip. Kwame battled guilt gnawing at his heart. But between them, without words, a strange connection grew, made of looks, gestures, an unspoken understanding that words didn't dare to touch. And so, while the neighborhood buzzed with rumors, in that simple house, a mother kept fighting for her daughter. And a man, disguised as a collector, found himself increasingly trapped by feelings too big to hide. The neighborhood seemed to breathe rumors. It was as if, on every corner, behind every half-open window, there was a voice whispering stories. Kwame's constant presence, though silent, and the child's sudden improvement, sparked more than curiosity. They stirred envy, resentment, a hunger for scandal. And no one hungered more for it than Idris. Wounded in his pride, rejected by a woman he thought powerless, Idris nursed his humiliation like a sweet poison. What stung most was not the refusal itself, but the dignity with which Amina had turned him down. He could not bear the thought that a poor seamstress had stood tall in the face of his offers. And now, to make matters worse, people whispered that she might have another man, a garbage collector, no less. On a stifling afternoon, over beer and malicious chatter, Idris devised his plan. Idle gossip was no longer enough. He needed to ruin Amina's reputation completely, so no client would ever come to her again, leaving her desperate, with no choice but to yield. He summoned 2 gossipy women, known for spreading any story that earned them a reward. With promises of fine fabrics and some money, he gave them detailed instructions. Say she has a married lover, that this filthy man who lurks around her house is no mere collector, but someone with a family who visits her late at night. Say she has secrets. The women will stop bringing their dresses, the clients will vanish, she won't be able to take it, and then she will return to me. The women, experts at insinuating without saying, sowed the poison. In alleyways, markets, sewing circles, the tale grew and twisted. Soon, even those who knew little repeated it confidently. Did you hear? The poor girl is sick from shame. Imagine the example her mother sets. The once faithful clients began to disappear. They delayed payments, made excuses, avoided Amina's house. In just a few days, the already meager income dwindled to nothing. Amina felt the blow. She didn't need words to understand what was happening. She knew too well how envy cloaked itself in false morality, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Idris, there was no doubt. One morning, he came himself, walking confidently, wearing a sly smile. He knocked, as if sure the tide had turned in his favor. When Amina answered, he spoke in a low, falsely concerned voice. Amina, the whole neighborhood talks. Your reputation is in ruins. No one wants your work anymore. It's a shame for a woman like you. But look, I can fix all this. One word from me, and the gossip will stop. The clients will return. You need only accept what you once refused. Come to my house, be mine, no more suffering. His words were like knives, each sentence a deeper cut. For a moment, Amina felt the weight of her situation, her sick daughter, her empty home, an uncertain future. But something stronger than fear remained, her dignity. She looked him in the eye, did not shout, did not plead, simply said, with calm strength, I would rather die sewing rags than live as your shadow. Leave my house. Caught off guard, Idris had no reply. He left fuming, more spiteful than ever. Kwame, watching from afar, nearly lost control. He wanted to intervene, reveal himself, confront Idris, but he restrained himself. It was not yet the time. One wrong move could cause Amina more pain. That night, as he passed discreetly by her house, he saw a scene that would stay with him. Amina, by the faint lamplight, seated at her loomis, tired but body upright, like a tree standing through storms, and beside her, her daughter sleeping peacefully. In that poor home, with few possessions, there still remained the greatest treasure, love and dignity. Kwame returned home with a heavy heart. He knew he needed to act, but how? What gesture would be right one, that would not wound the pride of this woman he so deeply admired? While the neighborhood simmered with rumors and lies, between two souls an invisible bond was forming, woven from respect, sorrow, and a hope, beginning, timidly, to grow. It was strange how sometimes the silence of night carried more weight than the shouts of the day. In that neighborhood, steeped in gossip and mistrust, the past few weeks had been hard. With each passing day, Kwame felt the knot in his chest tightened. The lie he had once thought harmless now seemed an unbearable burden. It had all started with a foolish idea, to dress as a garbage collector, to see people without the veil of wealth. But there, in that poor, forgotten neighborhood, he had found a woman unlike any other. A woman whose strength and dignity made him see himself as small, unworthy. And that was what gnawed at him now. In recent days, Idris' poison had taken hold. Clients had vanished, income dried up, and there was little food left in Amina's home. Kwame saw it in the smallest details. The girl's clothes, already plain, were now worn thin. The faint smell of watery beans drifted weakly from the window. Most painful of all, Amina's gaze was darker, not one of surrender, but of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share. That tormented Kwame. Seeing her in that state, partly because of his own lie and presence, unable to openly help, made him question his choices. That night, after wandering aimlessly with his old cart, he stopped in front of her house. The streets were empty. The wind blew cold, rustling the dry leaves. Inside, the lamp flickered. Kwame stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. Thoughts swirled through his mind. What if I left? What if I disappeared? If only he could tell her the truth. But how? How to explain the lie? How to ask forgiveness from someone who had always prized honesty, even when the world was against her? Finally, weary and defeated by his own doubts, he decided to leave. He no longer had the right to invade her world. His presence was doing more harm than good. He returned to his car, parked a few streets away. He sat behind the wheel, but before starting the engine, something stopped him. An unease, a deep pull, as if something within him refused to let him go. Driven by impulse, he walked back. Approaching the house, he carefully peeked through the window. That was when he saw a scene he would never forget. Halima, the little girl, was on her knees by the bed, hands clasped, head bowed. Her faint voice, almost a whisper, drifted through the glass. "God, please take care of my mummy. Don't let her cry anymore. I don't know how to pray pretty, but you know what I feel inside." Kwame felt a lump in his throat. He stood frozen, eyes misting. The girl's simple, pure prayer pierced through all vanity, all pride. There was more faith in that small prayer than in all the temples he had ever known. That was what had been missing. How could he leave now? How could he abandon this mother and daughter at such a cruel time? Resolved, he turned back. He would go home, not to give up, but to find another way. He could no longer hide behind a disguise, but he also couldn't rush in. The truth would have to come at the right time, in a way that wouldn't shatter what little peace Amina still had. That night, he didn't sleep. He paced back and forth, thoughts churning. The image of Halima kneeling, her small prayer, would not leave his mind. From that moment on, one thing became clear to him. Life had given him much money, comfort, power. But there, in that poor neighborhood, in that modest home, he had found something priceless: purity of heart, truth, love without masks. And whatever it took, he was determined. He would not abandon Amina, not while she needed him. Even if it meant facing his own fear, his own guilt, he would face it. For this was no longer a choice, it was a calling from the heart. And some callings cannot be denied. The following days brought a strange atmosphere to the neighborhood. It was as if people, who once barely looked at one another, were now more watchful, quieter, as though they sensed something was about to happen, though no one knew what. It wasn't just the tale of Amina and the collector that lingered in the air. There was a collective unease, a murmured tension that spread from mouth to mouth, heavy with suspicions. Kwame, though more determined than ever not to abandon Amina, also felt the weight of this new environment. His presence on the streets was no longer met with the same disguised disdain as before. Now, many looked at him curiously, others with suspicion. Idris' words spread like wildfire, had planted doubts and fed a tension that grew by the day. But fate, always eager to play its tricks, would not be content with mere gossip. One hot afternoon, while Kwame was pushing his old cart through a narrow alley, an old acquaintance appeared in his path. It was Abbasi, a longtime friend, a businessman who had come to that side of the city, seeking a renowned artisan. Seeing his friend in such a state, dirty, ragged, Abbasi could hardly believe his eyes. "Kwame, is that really you?" Kwame froze. The blood drained from his face. There was no way to hide. But with a quick tilt of his head, he whispered, "Abbasi, not here, not now." Abbasi, a sharp man, immediately sensed something bigger than a prank. He looked around and, noticing that some people were already watching, stepped away, promising to talk later. But the damage was done. It didn't take long for Idris to hear about the encounter. One of the boys who helped at his shop overheard part of the conversation and wasted no time spreading the news. For Idris, this was gold. He had always suspected something odd about the collector. Now, with confirmation that it was a man of wealth, perhaps even a billionaire, his thirst for revenge was reignited. But he wasn't a fool. He knew that exposing Kwame recklessly could be dangerous. And if Kwame truly was a powerful man, how could he face him? Prudence told him to proceed with caution, but his hunger to see Amina humiliated was stronger. So, he began spreading a new version of the tale. He didn't openly call Kwame a billionaire. He insinuated, he said, this collector was not who he seemed, that there was more behind his filthy facade, that no one lingered in those streets without a reason. The people, already primed with weeks of rumors, devoured the new gossip eagerly. Soon, in alleyways and markets, one could hear, "Have you heard? They say the man is someone important, hiding his true self." Imagine that. Amina, meanwhile, was unaware of this new twist. But she felt the heavy air. Neighbors looked at her differently, some with pity, others with veiled envy. And she, who had always walked with her head held high, now found herself surrounded by a world slipping beyond her control. Kwame, tormented, knew his time was running out. The lie that had protected him now threatened to collapse. Each time he crossed paths with Amina, he saw the unspoken question in her eyes, as if she sensed there was more, something he lacked the courage to say. That same week, the tension reached a new peak. During a quick visit to the market, Amina was approached by an acquaintance. "Be careful, Amina. People say you're involved with a dangerous man, that he's not who he claims to be. That trouble is coming." The words, said with false concern, felt like a dark warning, and for the first time in a long while, fear crept into Amina's heart, not for herself, but for her daughter, for the small world she fought to protect. That night, alone in her house, she reflected. Could the rumors be true? Who was this man who had appeared so suddenly, who helped without asking for anything? Why was he so close to her life? Kwame, for his part, felt cornered. He knew he had to tell the truth, but how? What if she rejected him? What if everything they had built, this silent connection, this mutual respect, came crashing down? Meanwhile, Idris, more cunning than ever, waited for the right moment. He planned to use what he knew or thought he knew as his final weapon. He knew the truth was about to explode, and he intended to be there at the exact moment to savor the destruction. And so, the neighborhood simmered with palpable tension. Conversations were hushed, glances furtive. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something as before a great storm. At the center of it all, a woman who only wanted to protect her daughter, a man seeking redemption, and a villain who didn't know that sometimes fate delivers its own justice without warning, but never failing. The nights were growing longer, and the wind carried a cold that seemed to seep into the bones. The neighborhood, once so stirred up by gossip, now breathed an air of tense expectation. It was as though everyone knew something was about to happen, though no one knew what. Footsteps on the streets grew more cautious, conversations shorter. Even the children, usually so noisy, seemed to play with less joy. In Amina's house, the weight of silence was heavier than ever. Halima was visibly worsening. Her cough, once occasional, was now constant. The girl's frail body struggled with every breath. Every night, Amina would wake suddenly to the sound of her daughter's labored breathing. The fear she had always hidden behind steady gestures and few words now throbbed in her chest. Kwame knew, even without entering the house, he could tell by the shadows behind the curtains, the footsteps he heard in the night, and the anguish consuming him could no longer be contained. The lie he had created, a game that once seemed harmless, now bound him like heavy chains. And the feeling he had for Amina, which had begun as growing respect, was now undeniable. It was no longer compassion or admiration. It was love, a love born in pain, forged in the small things, in shared silences, in glances that spoke more than 1,000 words. But how could he tell her the truth? How could he explain to such an honest woman that he was not who he claimed to be, that the ragged man who had quietly helped her was actually someone of wealth and power? The decision formed slowly in his heart, and on a night when the cold seemed to cut through skin, Kwame found his courage. He resolved to speak, to tell her the truth. He could no longer live imprisoned in disguise. He sat at his desk, not the one in the streets, but the real one, in his luxurious home where the contrast with the poor neighborhood seemed more glaring than ever. He took pen and paper and began to write. The words came slowly. How to tell the truth without sounding like another lie, how to explain his reasons. But with an open heart, he wrote. He told her who he was, why he had done it, the love that had grown inside him despite himself. When he finished, he read and reread. It was simple, sincere, all he could offer. The next morning, very early, he dressed in his collector's clothes one last time, took the envelope with the letter, and went to Amina's house. He stopped at the gate. His heart pounded as though it would leap from his chest. He took a deep breath, but just as he reached out to leave the letter, he heard from inside a sound that chilled him. It was Amina's restrained sobs, a sob not of physical pain, but of despair, and in her choked words, he heard something that stopped him. "My daughter, don't leave me. Hold on just a little longer. I don't know what to do anymore. ... double quotes. Kwame pulled back. He slipped the letter into his pocket. This was not the time. He could not heap more weight on her shoulders, not when her daughter was fighting for her life. He ran to his car. There was no more time for hesitation. He picked up the phone and called his private doctor, one of the most respected in the city. "I need you to come with me now. It's an emergency." The doctor, surprised by the urgency, agreed without question. In minutes, they were heading to the neighborhood. On the way, Kwame explained part of the story, not all, but enough to convey the seriousness of the situation. Meanwhile, in Amina's house, things had worsened. Halima's breathing grew more labored. Amina, with no one left to turn to, could only pray silently, her hands clutching her daughter's frail ones. Time seemed frozen. The cold night air mixed with the heat of desperation. The neighbors, alerted by whispers, began gathering quietly in the street. Kwame arrived not as the collector, but as the man he was. He stepped out of the luxury car, followed by the doctor with his medical bag. The doors of Amina's house opened to a scene no one there would ever forget. The poor woman, kneeling beside her daughter, looked up and saw the man entering clean, well-dressed, eyes filled with worry. For a moment, she didn't understand. Then it clicked. It was him, the man with the cart. Kwame said nothing. He knelt beside her. Please, let us help. This is no time for questions. It's time to save your daughter. Amina, stunned, nodded. The doctor acted quickly. The neighbors, once so quick to whisper, now watched in absolute silence. All eyes were on them. All doubts, all gossip, all malice vanished before that scene. And so, in a moment that would forever change their story, Kwame made his choice. No more disguise, no more lies, only the truth of his heart. And this choice would change everything. The night was dense, heavy, as if the sky itself shared the anguish that filled that house. Outside, the wind blew cold, but inside was where the real chill lived. Fear, despair, the looming risk of losing what was most precious. Halima, pale and weak, fought for each breath, her short, labored gasps, her face drenched in cold sweat. Beside her, Amina held her daughter's small, trembling hands, as though her touch alone could keep her from slipping away. When Kwame entered, there was no more mask, no more disguise. The man who crossed that threshold was no longer the ragged collector of old clothes, but the real man who had hidden behind silence. His presence filled the small room. He wore a simple suit, without ostentation, and his eyes carried a sincerity no wealth could match. Behind him, the doctor moved quickly. Within minutes, he set up a makeshift clinic, right there in the humble seamstress's home. Injections, medicine, oxygen. It was a fight against time, against fate. Outside, the gathered neighbors barely breathed. The women whispered among themselves. The men watched silently. The collector was, in fact, a man of means, an important man, and more than that, a man who, unlike the gossip, had not turned his back on the woman and her daughter. He was there, fully committed, fighting for them. Amina, confused, torn between fear for her daughter and the shock of the revelation, could barely react. Inside her swirled a storm of feelings: surprise, hurt over the deception, gratitude for the gesture, fear of trusting again. How to make sense of it all? After the worst of the crisis passed, and under the effects of the treatment, Halima finally drifted into a calmer sleep. The doctor withdrew, assuring them that with proper care, the girl now had a good chance of recovery. And then, silence remained. Amina and Kwame, face to face. She, standing, still trembling, her face marked by tears and sleepless nights. He, with the look of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long and could no longer hide. It was Kwame who broke the silence, his voice low, heavy with emotion. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. I didn't want you to see me as everyone else does. I didn't want you to think my care came from what I own, but from what I feel. Amina took a deep breath. Her gaze was firm, not of anger, but of deep hurt, the kind caused, not by malice, but by fear. A lie, even with good intentions, is still a lie, she replied, her voice calm but weary beyond the physical. Kwame bowed his head. There was no defense, only one truth to offer. I'm not asking for forgiveness, nor for acceptance. I only want you to know that every gesture, every word, was true. Because here, amidst all this, I found something I've never known: a love that can't be bought, a dignity no money can match. Beside them, little Halima, though still sleeping, seemed to sense the tension. She murmured softly in her sleep, "Mummy, he's good. Don't cry anymore." Those fragile, simple words pierced Amina's heart. It wasn't a grand speech, nor a promise. It was her daughter's pure voice. In that instant, part of Amina's wounded pride gave way, not from weakness, but from a greater love. Outside, the neighbors already knew. The story spread quickly, and for the first time, They no longer saw Amina as just a poor seamstress, but as a woman who, with honor and courage, had won something few could, a man of true worth. Idris, who had heard the whispers and rushed to witness the scene, arrived too late. Confronted with the gathered crowd and Qaim standing beside Amina, he backed away. He tried to maintain his composure, but the words he overheard echoed in his mind. It was not he who was the man of worth that day, and everyone knew it. Defeated, Idris withdrew, humiliated and ignored. In that simple home, among walls worn by time and hardship, something new was born. Not a fairy tale, not empty promises, but a possible new beginning, still fragile, still uncertain, but real. And in the corner of the room, Amina's loom remained as witness to it all, a symbol of who she had always been, a woman who, through the fiercest storms, never stopped weaving her own story, a story of truth, of faith, of love. And sometimes, life must unravel old threads so that a new destiny can be woven.